This is an introduction to continent building. You might have heard that the Grand Canyon is just a big hole in the ground. Well, in fact, it's not a hole at all. What do you think it might be? And how did it form? Those are the questions that we should have answered by the time we finish this slideshow. So I want you to make a note for yourself really quickly whether you agree or disagree with these next two statements. The first one is, the center of continents are flat and old. Do you agree or disagree with that? And the second statement is, continents are continually shrinking because of erosion. Again, do you agree or disagree? The key concepts that will be covered in this short presentation are, what are two ways continents grow, and what are the differences between interior plains, basins, and plateaus? Vocabulary words that we will cover will be plains, basins, and plateaus, those things that we are going to compare and contrast. So this is a map of the elevation in the United States. And so the darkest reddish colors are going to represent the highest elevations. And then the lighter yellow colors are going to be in less elevation. And as we get down into the darker greens, we're getting down closer to sea level. So you can see that on the very west coast out there around the San Francisco Bay Area, and then all along the east coast and along the western half of the United States, you find the highest elevations with the Rocky Mountain Range and the Great Basin and Range District that we'll talk about later. So you can see that we do find that flat plains are located mostly in the center of the country, with the highest elevations being near the edges. This elevation map of the world gives you a bigger picture about how things work all around the world. So it's not just in North America. All of the highest elevations that we find in the world are more near the edge of the continents they're located on, and with the center of those continents being much lower elevation and large flat areas. So how do continents grow? Well, we have two ways that we can produce new continent, new land on the edge of a continent. One of those is volcanic eruptions, which you can see in this picture. This is the Columbia Plain out in western United States, in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, where they had large-scale volcanic eruptions at one time that added land to our continent. And now the Columbia River has created this gorge in the middle of it. Continent building also involves some erosion and deposition, and that brings us to the large flat areas that we find in the middle of the countries and the middle of the continents that are called the plains. This is a picture of the Great Plains in the middle of the United States. And it definitely fits the definition of a plain. It's an expansive area of level or rolling land. So there's a lot of space out there for wild animals to roam around in. So the Great Plains is found in the middle of the United States. They were once covered by shallow seas. We can see that in the sediments that we find there. And they've been flattened over millions of years through the process of weathering and erosion to make them very smooth, relatively speaking, to the rest. They aren't the only place that we find plains, though. You can also see on the map that we have plains near the coast where similar processes have been taking place as things get eroded away and flattened out. And then we have the Great Basin that we find between the Rocky Mountains and the mountains of the coast, the volcanic mountains that are created from the subduction. A basin is an area of subsidence or a region with low elevation. So, relatively speaking, it's low because it's surrounded by the mountains on both sides. Sediments from the mountains on the east and the west accumulate in the Great Basin. That happens over millions and millions of years. And as that piles up and creates pressure and adds heat, those sediments have turned into rich oil and natural gas and coal fields that are mined today. Our third and final geographic area that we want to talk about are plateaus. And those are the flat regions with high elevations that we find in different parts of the world. Two that I'd like to point out to you are the Tibetan Plateau. It's in Asia, just north of where Mount Everest and the Himalayan mountains are. And there's a large high region there. And also on the west coast of the United States, we find the Colorado Plateau. And that's the area where we find the Grand Canyon, the picture that we saw on the very first slide of this presentation. These areas happen because of uplift, so that area is raised, and then the Colorado River cut its way down through the middle of it. Sometimes it can also happen due to eruptions and with lava flows that create these large plateaus, which would be similar to the Columbia Plateau that we also saw a picture of, where the Columbia River is cutting through it in Washington State. So I hope you've learned something about these dynamic landforms and how Earth's surface is constantly changing. Mountains form and erode away, and continents grow and shift and shrink constantly all over the place. As we wrap things up, let's go back and see what you think about those original statements that I had you decide whether you agree or disagree with. The first one was the center of the continents are flat and old. So do you agree or disagree with that at this point? Hopefully you are in agreement. The center of the continents are older than the regions near the edges of the continents, and the continents grow from plate collision along those boundaries. So it's definitely flat out in the center, and it's older because the edges are getting new land added. And the second statement is continents are continually shrinking because of erosion. This one you should have disagreed with, because although it is occurring, new rock is being added all the time through volcanic eruptions and the addition of land at those convergent boundaries. So the key concepts that we are trying to cover and the initial question that we should review are, what are two ways continents grow? So we know that they are shrinking because of erosion and rifting, but they are growing due to volcanic activity and continental collisions. And our second one was, what are the differences between interior plains, basins, and plateaus? And now we know that large flat regions at high elevation are called plateaus, and basins are regions of low elevation where sediments accumulate or once accumulated. And plains are just large flat areas, which could include both of those. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.